Welcome to the riskadvisor.com podcast. I am Jim Henry and here with my good friend and co-host Sal Lafreri. Before we begin, I would like to remind each of you to subscribe to this show and push the like button for us. Please leave your comments as your opinions are important to us. Today's topic are CEO security issues. What is happening to the organization's security functions? Today's CEOs are faced with a complex series of issues regarding security. The crossover between IT security and physical security is becoming closer and closer. Additionally, coordination between multiple facilities needs to be done under the corporate security director. And if that isn't a tall enough order, CEOs are now facing, with all of the unrest that we've seen of late, a consideration of whether or not, they have the right security officer in place, or if it's not a full-time job, looking to hire a person, for that position, because of the level of risk that they're facing now, in the last 6 months does not promise to be going away anytime too soon. So today's guest is my partner, Sal Lafreri, who has engaged in the capacity of being a corporate security officer in addition to his tenure from law enforcement and whatnot. So a great person by which to present this problem and discussion to with regards to what's the best path forward. So Sal, let's start with who to hire. Should it be ex-law enforcement officers as the pedigree that you come from? And what do you see as and how a person acquires that experience in the corporate world that they don't get in the law enforcement environment?
So I think first we need to make a slight distinction on the chief security officers as compared to a security director, in that, a lot of sort of major corporations will have chief security officers and they have a very long tenure of either law enforcement experience or private security experience, and they've gone through, and so they're much more at the executive level. It's the one step below that, the security director, where we really have a lot of significant issues that pop up. So, the first question is always, well, gee, if I'm going to get somebody as a security director, I want to get somebody that knows about security, and, who better than a law enforcement officer? And not that I'm trying to throw law enforcement under the bus here, but because a guy directed traffic for a police department for 20 years does not make him a terrorism expert, right? Does not make him a security expert, right? There's a whole lot of things that they need to know and need to understand. And that's one of the critical issues, when you're looking at people like that, when they're coming through. We see this often, and I see it today in clients that I have. We have a security director that is sort of the role model for like what the security director shouldn't be. That's the role model, and this is you could be able to find their picture in a book under definitions. Do you get somebody from law enforcement? Yeah, if you're going to, the problem that you run into is you get them if you're looking to hire someone with significant experience in the department, where you're getting a chief or, an assistant chief, deputy chief, or chief of the department or commissioner, you got to pay for that, right? And that's way more up at like the CSO level, right? The chief security officer level. When you're looking at the security director role, it really is difficult because you're not getting those that have that much experience. And when you look at the functions and roles that you want them to provide, you realize the shortfall. And a lot of times I spend time with CEOs talking to them, or operations directors talking to them about their security directors, and they realize they're basically running an incubator program for that to train somebody to be a director.
So does that mean that you have to be watchful, let's say, of raw talent that does have some security experience, but lacks the tact and polish, and may also bring along a little ego to the position as well? Yeah.
Egomaniac. Yes. It's incredible. And they come in and all of a sudden, they're the little Napoleons, right? They, my fiefdom, and this is what I got, and look at what I'm doing. And this is my staff and my crew. And we'll get into some of this about how these guys wind up thinking that, they got this huge staff under them. And in reality, it's outsourced security guards. But yeah, I mean, it especially when you get somebody that at the lower levels in the departments from law enforcement, when you get them at that lower level where they don't have the exposure to the corporations. And, one of the things that I always said that the department should do is at the higher levels, at, captains and above, inspectors and above, when they're ready to retire, their union actually sits them down and gives them a whole training course. What to wear, how to dress for an interview, how to do your resume, how to interview properly, what to say, what to do, what not to say, how to present. They do all of those things and they walk them through it. The majority of law enforcement officers that are coming out today have no real experience in corporate America. And that's where they get themselves in trouble. It's something that they just don't. They're a fish out of water is basically what it is. But because they got a law enforcement background, because they carry a gun, they're looked at as the right choice. And we see this constantly occurring. As in my role, I have to go in and put out a lot of the fires sometimes just to be able to walk them through.
So the interview process, hitting on personality traits, is very important.
Yeah, I mean, everybody is normally, when they're going for an interview, everybody is pretty much on, the best behavior, right? The yes sir, no sir, and kind of, they play the game well. But that's, that's part of when you're doing the interview with them. Sometimes you may want to dig a little bit. I talk about, drilling for the nerve. See if you can get a little bit of a rise out of them. See how they're going to react to certain things. If they're not giving you the standard answer, you want that person that is going to be able to be sort of the statesman, right? That's going to be able to talk to board members. That's going to be able to talk to, other vendors that you have and create these relationships. And yeah, you don't want that guy's, sitting there with the, hey, I'm in charge. I got this. And, if you think about law enforcement role, I mean, for the most part, that's exactly what happens, right? Something bad happens. You call a cop. The cop shows up. And we take over, right? We tell you what you're going to do, right? We are in charge, and that's the the type A personality that you have. When you're getting into corporate America now, you're talking about a totally different thing.
So the resume check and references, unless this is a person that you already have a lot of experience with or have a lot of, direct personal references for, that's really important to be able to, find out how they have behaved under some stressful circumstances.
I'm starting to giggle because the first thought that came through my mind when we talk about, with the resume check and, when you start making phone calls, right? Inevitably you run across this, and maybe not as frequent. There's other situations, but you run across this pretty often. If you want to get rid of a problem, you promote it in law enforcement, right? If you got a guy who has an opportunity, you got an opportunity to get rid of the guy, and the phone call comes in and, hey, what do you think about Sal? He is wonderful. He is great. Yeah, I would take him in a heartbeat. Yeah. And all they're really doing is just looking to get rid of them.
So someone that has a series of very frequent promotions, that could be very good, and it could be very bad.
And it could be very bad. It's just what do you want from them? And we were talking about it earlier when one of the things that happens in law enforcement is that the officers, and especially at the lower levels, the patrolmen, sergeants, lieutenants, don't recognize their worth, and they don't recognize the level of training that they have and the significance of all of that, and they undervalue themselves. And a lot of times you may not even see that on a resume. If the fish out of water comes in to a lot of the cops, and a lot of the attitude is, yeah, it was just bullshit, Yeah, but you had this training, and you took this course. Yeah, it's bullshit. This is no big deal, right? But in the private sector, it's important, right? And there's a value to it. So when you're going through the resume, you may want to take a look at that and see, okay, what are the training do you have? What are the things that are missing, that aren't listed? And then actually, sitting down and talking to people and saying, what do you think of this particular person? Because they got to retire doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be the right fit. It may go back to the original thing that I had said, they may have been directing traffic, for, 10 years. And all of a sudden you're trying to put them into a role, the round peg in the square hole. It just doesn't work.
So is really the key thing to be looking for then in the dialogue when you get that conversation going with them to see if all of their answers are just self-centric about themselves rather than talking about their team and their accomplishments as a team? Is that really what separates the wheat from the chaff?
It's sort of, but what's problematic, and think about how the fire department operates, right? 5, 6 guys on a truck, right? They live together, right? They don't do anything without each other, right? If they're going to go food shopping, 6 guys have to go food shopping, right? They don't send one guy out. In law enforcement, it's basically you and your partner. There is no large, contingent to come along with it. So to get them in an interview and for them to understand the team building is something that the nature of the job doesn't lend itself to. But if you've got somebody that's like that can sit down and talk about it, that's something that you really got to pay attention to, because that becomes somebody that's special. They're recognizing the team building, because what you're going to ask them to do downrange is just that, is to become this team builder and sort of be the band leader and get everybody playing on the same note. And a lot of times, and we see this over and over and over again, it's just a bad selection for what you want them to do.
Well, that's a good place to take a break here for the first session. Remind everyone you are listening to the Risk Advisor podcast hosted by myself, Jim Henry, and Sal Lafreri. We invite you to comment on our blog, at our social media like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And if you are interested in having one or both of us speak at an upcoming event or would like to consult with us, please go to our webpage at theriskadvisor.com to set that up. So let's talk some logistics here. We're talking about ex-law enforcement officers having no real corporate experience, such as preparing a budget or a job description. How do you nurture them along with that? Assuming you've got the right personality of person and, now you're looking for somebody that's malleable into something that they have not been before.
Again, when you think about it, when you're looking at the person with the, like a chief of a department who's had to work within a budget, who's working with manpower, was able to put people, groups together and, get teams working together. And that's a lot easier. At the security director level, when you got somebody that, was running cases, didn't have a budget responsibility, doesn't know how to put together a budget. And I'm not talking about, the X's and O's of, working, Excel spreadsheets. I'm talking about somebody that just has no recognition of a budget at all. And unfortunately, in most of law enforcement positions, budget was never an issue. You never worried about. The only time you ever associated a budget to your position was when you were told that they were going to cut the overtime because they didn't have the money for it. And then all of a sudden you started recognizing budgets. But you take somebody and you put them into a situation and you say, okay, here's your budget. You got, a $1 million budget. I want you to, here's the amount of money you have. How are you going to spend this money? Right? Or worse, try and get them to look at capital expenditures, or try and get them to look at technology and understand the technology. And that's the big drop, is that they have absolutely no clue about it. To them, it's, you show your card, to the turnstile and turnstile opens.
Well, that was the case. That was the case 15, 20 years ago. You think that's still the case now? I mean, the law enforcement's been living, even in the patrol cars, with a lot of electronics, over the course of the last 20 years. But you think that is still a drag?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Without a doubt, it is. They don't get the exposure to it. I mean, probably a great example, thing that's popping in my head. You watch Netflix at home, right? You turn your TV on and you know where to go to get Netflix, right? And you know that Netflix is coming in on Wi-Fi. But you don't understand all of the mechanics behind that, right? You don't necessarily understand the router. You know that the TV's got to talk to the router. And if it doesn't work, I'll push a button, reboot, and see if it works. And it works, and you move on, right? Similarly, here, they don't understand the integration of the systems that well. Now, and this isn't for, I'm not saying this for everybody, right? I'm sure there are a lot of them that are familiar with it. But for the most part, when they come in, the learning curve is so steep. They don't have that concept that, gee, maybe 5 years we're going to have to replace servers. Or, hey, we're going to the cameras need to be on a maintenance, schedule. We need to be able to come in and do it. And there's a great reliance, and it comes back into your world, right? The integrators. How many times do you see the problem where you got the security directors relying on the integrator, and if the integrator is doing his job or is taking an extra step, is going to advise them, hey, by the way, next year we're going to need to replace these 3 cameras. Make sure we got some money for it, right? But left to their own volition, left to themselves to be able to do it, they're just not up on it. They may recognize that some technologies exist. I have a client who I meet with the directors, and I tell them, Christmas is coming. Why don't you give Santa a list of the toys that you would like? It's 7-8 years running. I've yet to get a list. They have no clue.
So, kind of staying with this theme of competence versus incompetence, in certain areas, whether it be the budgets, whether it be technology or whatnot. Most often, incompetent people, kind of defend that with bullying. They're coming from a position of having been, authoritative figures, and they don't want to expose the fact that they are ill-advised or inexperienced in certain areas. You talk about the dialogue with an integrator where an integrator would give constructive input and one that is comfortable with what they don't know and what they do know and receptive on learning and whatnot will accept that information constructively. Others will bark back like, I know what I'm doing. I don't need your help. I don't, and again, that's probably easier to weed out than the ones that actually have a higher degree of competence, but are still bullies. Because that's tougher, to really find those. Even though they are in the minority, they could be a very attractive candidate because you can see that. But it doesn't mean, that they still don't carry that bully DNA.
Well, if you're going to be sarcastic, you got to be good, right? You got to be competent to be sarcastic, right? And to have that attitude, that overconfidence. But yeah, you wind up with, and we see this all the time, right? We see this in life. You get somebody that comes in that's the round peg in the square hole and is the old fish out of water. They keep using that expression. And then what do? They break one or two ways, right? Either they come to you and they, listen, I got no clue how to do the budget. Can you give me some help? And if you got the right team around and you got the right people around, everybody sort of rallies and you go and you try and help them and everybody jumps in and it becomes this team effort and it all works well. We've seen, and we see this often, where you get somebody who's incompetent and decides that they want to mask that and they become the bully. And once you start going down that road, I mean, you're in for one hell of a ride, right? Because as you, the guy that hired this knucklehead, now all of a sudden you're getting the phone calls. Hey, can you believe what he did? He overreacted. He was screaming at people. He's yelling at people. And then HR gets in the middle of it, right? Because inevitably they're going to say something that's inappropriate. And you wind up spending all of this time trying to deal with this particular person, and all of that comes back to, from the hiring process, right? What really did this person, have to say, and, what was that personality trait that, that he exhibited that you should have gone for? It happens again and again and again. And they try and mask the incompetence by being by being overly confident or being, by becoming the bully. And especially in today's day and age, and in this world with HR being what it is, and the ease of being able to get yourself in trouble, it's just not good.
So, I'm taking then that requests for some assistance, administrative assistance to help them do their job better should be looked at as a positive, as opposed to just requests for more staff without justification of why and to do what would not be a good indicator. Maybe just be building a fiefdom, maybe insulating themselves so that some of those shortcomings are not as exposed and they feel less threatened by leaning on this new staff for those questions than going to senior management and being open and upfront with them where they need a little bit of help.
Yeah. I mean, nobody wants to go to the boss. When the boss asks you to do something, nobody wants to go to the boss and look and go, yeah, I don't know how to do that. Right. And it's just, you can't go to the well too many times with that, So, they'll come out and they'll say, hey, we need more, I need more staff. I'm too busy. I need an assistant, and that's the first clue, right? You're hiring somebody and you don't have within your budget, you're not thinking that, you're going to need a support staff. And now all of a sudden they need the executive assistant or, they need the person that's going to be able to do scheduling or the person that's going to be able to do payroll is going to be able to do this and do that. And all of a sudden, things just start growing exponentially on you. And you sit there and you go, wait a second, what the hell? What do I need him for? Now I'm hiring all these other people. So I need to put all of the support behind this. It's something that, I should have had one guy that should have been able to do this. And that's where you start to realize that you've made the terrible mistake. And what happens as the executive, you bring this person in. You don't want to show that you made the mistake, right? So what do? You tolerate this for how long? And then you get to a point where it's just absolute frustration. It's absolute problems. You may wind up in the middle of lawsuits. You may wind up with clients leaving. You may wind up with, vendors, firing you. I mean, how many times have we seen that, right? Where you just, your phrase, right? The juice wasn't worth the squeeze. Mm-hmm. You know what? Screw this. I ain't putting up with this bullshit anymore. I'm out of here. Bye. I'm done. And so you wind up losing vendors that have been with you for years. So you see all of those things start to develop and you just kind of realize like, oh man, this is a mistake. And the best thing to do at that point, logistically, is cut your losses quick.
Right. Well, whether you got a good apple of that apple or a mediocre apple in the position, let's talk a little bit about the liabilities of empowering somebody with that title. And I imagine that's also impacted by whether they're direct employment, whether it's co-employment, and whether they're armed or not.
Yeah, I mean, liabilities come in. So you got this, in essence, rogue agent that keeps, popping off and keeps yelling and screaming at people and causing all of those issues. More importantly, and especially in today's world within security, most companies today are outsourcing the security guard services. They're outsourcing to security guard services. And there's a tremendous advantage to that is that, you bring somebody in and if there's a guard who's a security professional who's not operating to your standard, you can, hey, I want that person gone. And it's written into the contract that, you can move the people around. So it's not that they're getting terminated from their employment. They're just not going to work on your account anymore. And there's a great advantage for having that. But one of the problems that we see, and this is a huge issue, is the whole co-employment issue. And that's a tremendous liability that companies face. When you have a security director who believes that he has his own little fiefdom and he has his staff, his team under him, and they're outsourced security guards, they're not his employees. They're not part of his staff. And any of the requests that they make to the people, what they have to do is make it to the security guard supervisor, who in essence would make the changes that you're looking for. If you go to, and it's something as simple as if you go to the guard and you tell the guard, I don't want you standing here, I want you standing over there, and something happens, all of the protections that you had from hiring that guard company, you've just lost because you've taken over, and it's called co-employment. it's a liability and it's really problematic. You just can't, you just should not be dealing with it. And I'm hard pressed to think about a situation where this doesn't occur, where the directors just don't recognize it, or in the course of day-to-day operations either forget about it. And that's when the liability pops up, right? That's when things are going to happen. Right? That's when
and yet you would think that is fundamentally understood by them, understanding a chain of, they've lived in it with a chain of command, when they're in the field of law enforcement, and, kind of like the Simon Says thing, you're okay if it's, you talk to the supervisor, Simon says do this, Simon says do that, rather than just do this, do that. And that's just undermining the chain of command. But does ego make their memory somewhat fog about what their appreciation for chain of command, was when they were in law enforcement directly?
Yeah, great way to put it. It's the, I'm in charge now. This is me. I got this, and I'm telling him, this is where I want you to be. This is what I want you to do. This is what you got. Yeah, whoa, time out. You go to the supervisor, you tell the supervisor what happens. You would think, as if you think about it, and as you're saying, that would make, chain of command would make sense, right? I'm the boss. I go to the supervisor, and the supervisor's supposed to tell the underling. I shouldn't have to tell the underling. When you get into the private security world, totally different ballgame. They get in and they don't realize that, they don't recognize that, and it's all of a sudden, they don't want to be left alone. They don't want the recognition that they're working alone. You're in charge of, I'm the director of security for X company. Yeah, okay, that's nice. That's great. You got no staff, no assistant, and hired guards. Take a bow. Go ahead.
Right.
So no, the ego jumps in the middle of that, and, they got the responsibility.
Well, it just reinforces the need for the personality profile, on the inbound, and probably some good onboarding by management when they are brought aboard to have them understand, in the case of co-employment, the reality of corporate liability and the fact that they are a representative of senior management there and have to ensure and protect, from a liability perspective, the company that employs them.
Yeah, no, it's true. And again, that goes back to the whole understanding corporate culture, understanding, corporations, and understanding what it's like to be, functional in a corporation.
Right.
But the majority of stuff that happens in corporations, or a big driver of what happens, is politics. How many times do you have to make a decision that, this has got to happen? Why? It's his brother-in-law, or, this one's cousin is coming in, or, we want to do X, but, politically we need to be able to do it this way, or we have to give this one an opportunity, or whatever, right? They have to be able to operate within a political minefield. And that's one of those things that's going to pop up on them.
Right. Well, we'll take another break here before we get into the solution segment, where we'll drill down into the really specific required skills for the position. You are listening to the Risk Advisor podcast, hosted by myself, Jim Henry, and Sal Frary. We invite you to comment on our blog at theriskadvisor.com and to subscribe and follow us on our social media like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you are interested in having one or more or both of us speak at an upcoming event, or would like to consult with us, please go to our webpage at theriskadvisor.com to set that up. So, skill sets. Let's start with the biggest and most obvious, right? Relationship leader.
Yeah. So as is, the American Society of Industrial Security set up a guideline that talks about, when you're going to hire as a chief security officer. And I think that if you follow the recommendations, you think you wind up, you're not going to go bad as you work your way down the food chain. If you're going from the chief security officer down to the security director, and to start off, right, the relationship leader, right, he's the person that's going to nurture those relationships with everybody, and he's going to be the leader of the group. And he's also going to wind up having to deal with, the government officials that are going to come in. You're going to get other law enforcement agencies that are going to come in that may visit the facility. And then, most importantly is the interaction that they're going to have with the clients, right? Or a tenant in the building. If you're talking about, commercial properties, the people that are actually signing the checks, that are putting the money into the pocket, are the ones that you need to be able to develop the relationships with. And, taking that real hard stand is just not going to work. So one of the key things that you really want to look at from them is that relationship leader, the ability to be able to develop those cohesive relationships is critical.
So you mentioned, in the last segment about, they're going to encounter a lot of, political situations. So what you're really saying is they have to be a bit of a politician themselves too. And whether a politician looks at people that voted for them or didn't vote for them, they have to look at, their clients, their tenants and whatnot, in the building as similar. They have to win the hearts and minds of each one of them, whether or not they really would be best friends on the outside.
It's true. I mean, one of the most difficult things, right, is to be able to, be civil to someone that, you really dislike, right? And that's the real test, right? Me and you get along really well, and it's easy to spend time and chat and work on a project and do this, and it's great to do it. But if we really outright hated each other, right, it's going to be a real hard test of being able to, to get things to work. And that's where you really need that person who has the political capability to recognize politics and be able to deal with it. And,
well, they've at the end of the day, they've got to win the trust of their constituents, and that's the only way they're going to have open communications and truly be able to identify areas that there are problems and correct them.
It's funny you talk about being a politician. It just spurned something in the back of my mind, and that was a few years back. Was talking to a buddy who was in the Internal Affairs Division, and we were talking about there was this whole big thing about cops being discourteous, and we were chatting about it, and he said, to get past the discourteous, with cops being discourteous to citizens, he said, if all we need to do is get rid of one word in the English language, he said, and 90% of the complaints against the cops would drop. He said, but we can't get them to stop using it. I said, what's that? And he went, asshole. And that's what you're dealing with. You got a guy who comes in, who sits down and, politically correct. Oh, he's full of shit. I ain't talking to this guy.
Right.
Get rid of that one word and you've solved the problem.
So what else we got here in our litany of skill sets?
Somebody with some executive management experience, I think is really sort of important. When you bring somebody on and you recognize that you want them for a prolonged period of time, you want them to have a career, I think it's important that you take them through a management program. You start, teach them some executive management techniques. I think that's it's important. Law enforcement does that as you get to the higher levels. They'll put you through executive management school. That's something that at the lower levels doesn't occur, but I think it's something that's important. Let them understand what those skills are and work on them. And especially, you have to make the investment. Yeah, you're not going to get somebody that's, perfect out of the box, right? You're bringing somebody in. You want them to hopefully be with the company for a long time. You're not looking for somebody for a year or two, quick in and out. Get somebody in, make the investment in them, and get them some training. Get them to understand, and mandate it that they go for executive training, that they go for some technology, some familiarization with the systems. Not that you want them to become technicians and start, throwing switches in the field, but let them get a good understanding of it.
Well, that leads us into the subject matter expertise we talked about in the other two segments that, if they're coming out of law enforcement, they certainly have a degree of law enforcement subject matter expertise. That doesn't necessarily mean it's broader security subject matter expertise, particularly on the technical side. And again, if you've got the right personality, you've got a person that can add to their skill set, in that area. But that's really key. And it's rare that you're going to find one that is so well-rounded that they have a great grasp of the technology and the management skills and that experience because, they'd probably be the captain or the commissioner, yeah. and going for the CISO position.
Yeah, that's true. You want to understand what their capabilities are, what their experiences are, what they can do. More importantly, they shouldn't come in when you're bringing them in and you're hiring them. You shouldn't consider that you got the final product. What you really got to expect when you bring in someone in like that is that there's this growing that you want them to do. It's kind of funny. And when you look at the military structure, within the military, they train downward, right? So a sergeant needs to know what the lieutenant's job is. The lieutenant needs to know what the captain's job is. The captain needs to know what the colonel's job is. Right? Everybody gets trained so that in the event that the top guy gets taken out, everybody can step up and move in. In the civilian world, that doesn't happen. If I'm the security director and I have above me and I'm reporting to a chief security officer, in the civilian world, the CSO is not training the director to take over his job because he's going to lose his job. Right? The theory is, I never train anybody, to become as smart as me, so I lose the job, and that's really problematic. You really can't operate in that sort of a vacuum because, God forbid, something happens to the top guy. Now you got this vacuum that you've created. So you need to be able to get everybody trained and use the military model and create that level of expertise that is just missing.
So another one of the 6 key required skills that as is lists is that of a governance team member. Is that the toughest one?
Yeah, because he's got to provide the leadership and support to an organization's, governing team, and he's got to be able to manipulate everybody and sort of be that guy that's going to be politically correct. He's going to be the guy that's going to get everybody around the table. And, that inevitably they got to be able to do some governing. And, sometimes you got to make some really hard decisions. And you got to get somebody that's willing to make those tough decisions. It's always great, to always run in and tell, go to daddy, right? Or go to mommy and, hey, I got a problem. When I was in the roles that I was in, if somebody walked in the office and said, hey, boss, we got a problem, I just look at him and go, okay. And I would just let it hang. And I would expect them to come in with some solutions with it. And if they didn't have a solution, I'd throw them out of the office and tell them, go figure something out and come back and talk to me when you got something. And, the purpose, I guess it wasn't great team building, but it was the concept behind that was that, if you come walking in and you got a problem, you're not dumping a problem on my desk. You got to take the responsibility and show me some leadership and that you got a solution to this. What's your solution to it? Now, they may have come in with something that made absolutely no sense or wouldn't work for any one of a number of reasons. And I would say, okay, fine. I understand what you're saying, but I think we're going to go in this way. And we would talk about it and we'd explain it to them why we may not do it. Sometimes, more times than not, if they came in with a solution, it actually was appropriate. And okay, great. And you move on. So something to keep in mind.
So another one of the postulates is that of a risk executive. Is that a challenge because that gets into many more shades of gray than the black and white, good guy, bad guy, that they were more accustomed to? You're either following the law, you're breaking the law. And in this case, there's a whole different level of assessment in degrees of risk that they need to be able to evaluate, communicate, and prioritize.
Yeah, and that's you see this a lot at the C level where somebody will identify a risk, bring it to you, and say, we've identified this as a risk. And the English translation that's running around in the person's mind, it's the C-suite person's mind is just wonderful, another problem, right? And you're giving me a risk that I got to be able to identify, I have to be able to now react, because it comes down to what did you know and when did you know it, right? So they need to be able to recognize the risk, but also understand how does that all play into either the corporate philosophy or, how things are looked at, how well they're going to be received. And again, that, there's obviously an element of politics that plays into the middle of all of that.
Right. Well, last but not least, after you've got a risk assessment and a prioritization, that's all building into strategy. So being a strategist, again, that's probably furthest afield from what their previous career was. How often is a person that's really coming out of law enforcement able to really do that on their own without really some coaching at an executive level from senior management, if they have not had that kind of corporate training? In a lot of ways, it's the blind leading the blind. You have the concept of risk that a CEO might have, maybe absolutely 180 degrees in the other direction of a risk that a security director is going to look at. And you start looking at those things, and the director is going to have to understand what the tolerance is going to be, and then, what those issues are, and be able to prioritize them and put them into some sort of a working order, right? So a risk is a risk is a risk. And if you recognize the risk, then that's great. You've recognized the risk. But in most times, in virtually every situation, you're looking at multiple risks. And when you're looking at multiple risks, you have to be able to prioritize it. Because what winds up happening in all of the risk assessments, you identify all of the risk, you put them down, and then what do you do in reality? The next thing you do is you start looking at what's going to cost for this. And it becomes a math problem. I got in this risk, it's going to cost me X number of dollars. I only have a total of Y. How many X's can I handle that's going to get me to the Y number? And then I'm going to have to push those off to next year to another budget, or I'm going to have to look for a variance, or I'm going to have to move this one up to the next one. And that's where you're going to start playing with your risks. So in a larger organization that has a CSO and or maybe a CISO, are they more likely to keep that ownership of risk assessment and strategic planning and whatnot at that level rather than pushing down to or involving the security director? And is that a two-edged sword? Is it good to have the CISO or the CSO be the ones that are vetting and hiring the security director? Or on the positive, they could be part of that team. They could be grooming them for, a depth chart there in the organization that makes them all stronger. Or they could purposely look for somebody that's going to stay out of their space and stay out of their swim lane and enable them to own that domain.
It all comes down to how the organization is structured, right? If you have the silos that are built, operations may not be talking to IT. IT may not be talking to the CISO, in strange situations. Risk winds up playing an element in this. Right, asset management plays an element in it. Who does the security director ultimately report to? If you have a chief security officer, you would assume that the security directors are going to report to the chief security officer. Not necessarily in every case, right? You could have it much more localized where the security director is reporting to a facility person, a facility manager, or a facility director, or an operations director, in which case you're really starting the brouhaha, because when the chief security officer is looking for something and he's looking at the director, I've actually seen it where the director says, no, I got to go talk to the operations guy before I can give you anything. The operations manager has to approve this. And you look at it and inevitably the question comes out is, whose side are you on? And that's where the conflict comes in. So how the organization ultimately operates is really a function of all of that interaction. It should be a lot simpler. And I shake my head a lot of times and just say, it can't be this difficult.
Is that, even though it's more difficult to have all of those coordinations and communications, I would think that is, given the level of risks now that are virtual and not just physical, it is preferable to have those CISO and CSO positions as well as the security director if you can afford it. And of course, as I said at the beginning of the show, with the social unrest that we've seen, recently here in 2020, what jobs that were either part-time or even full-time at the security director level, if they were bridging all of this, they've become more of a challenge. And I would expect we're going to see corporations, rethinking that security team structure going forward, because there are risks, exposures, and issues with response now that they really weren't considering a year ago.
And, as most things in life, right, it all comes down to money, right? Inevitably, when somebody says, it's not about the money, if they lead with that, it's about the money. It's the same thing here. What budget is going to be affected by it, right? The IT, and look at what we're seeing now with convergence, right? With where we're getting this crossover between IT and security systems. Right now, all of a sudden, you have IT coming out and saying, hey, that server needs to be upgraded, or, these switches need to be patched, or you need whatever, right? And you go through all of the different things that need to be. Where security owned it, now all of a sudden IT's got a piece of it. And they want things changed, they want things updated, they want things done. Who's paying for it? And inevitably, who's ever signing the check now owns it. And so now you got that whole battle that comes out. Yeah, it's great to have the different groups together. Ideally, they should be all working together and all for the same purpose. But if you have an organizational structure that's put in where security directors are reporting to operations, the chief security officer is reporting to the CEO, and you have a CISO dealing with IT, grab the popcorn. It's a fun show to watch.
Well, one silver lining in the deep looming black cloud of 2020, it may be that some of this movement for defunding the police and whatnot, in one case, it's accelerating, the retirement of those that have been, in law enforcement for 15, 20 years. And many of them don't have the technical skills, the IT skills that, you're talking about, stepping into organizations on the corporate side. Could also be that a number of the younger recruits that have only been in law enforcement for a few years and our millennial generation come inherently with more technical and IT skills than their predecessors in law enforcement. If they're moving on into the corporate world, they may actually bring in more fundamental capability there to be able to communicate at that level with IT and have less of a divide between the two of them. You think that's
I think
maybe not probable, but at least possible.
I think education will play a big part into it, right? I mean, a lot of the law enforcement agencies today, they want you to have a college education. A lot of them are, coming out with business and marketing degrees, and some of them criminal justice, but and some of them they have in finance, and they have better rounded backgrounds coming into it. I think the advent of them being able to understand technology, way better than I think we do. I think all of that'll play a role in it. I think as we get more and more familiar with systems. And I think, when you look at the technology side of it, right, some of the stuff that we've already looked at, right, some of the edge technology is just getting a whole lot smarter and a whole lot simpler. It's doing a hell of a lot more, but it's just a hell of a lot simpler.
Right.
So there'll be a lot more, I think, familiarity with it. And I think that's where we're going to wind up seeing some changes.
Right. Well, Sal, thank you for this subject matter and your experience, in this area. Hopefully it'll help the digestion of the turkey from Thanksgiving a little bit better. And before I do the little wrap-up statement here at the end, a short look ahead. When we get into January, since we do have an apparent new president that will be coming in the end of January, and there appears to be movement toward some breaking of the ice with regards to the next stimulus package, and a lot of talk again about infrastructure spending that holds the promise for quite a bit of government spending or government funded projects, in the area of infrastructure. So we thought it would be timely to do a few shows, on doing business with the federal government or with government agencies as we prepare for that, which will probably come out, later in 2021. So we will be honored to have as our guest Stuart Lieberman, who has worked in a capacity for a number of public agencies through his storied career. He's now retired. One of his roles, one of his titles, was the agency chief contract officer for the New York State Board of Elections. And again, he can give us some good insight as to how to navigate those waters in doing business with government entities. So you have been listening to the Risk Advisor podcast hosted by myself, Jim Henry, and Sal Lafreri. We ask you to subscribe to this show and like us on our social media sites like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We remind you and ask if you are interested in having one or both of us speak at an upcoming event or would like to consult with us. Please go to our webpage at theriskadvisor.com to set that up. Remember, you can hear the show on your favorite podcast platform, YouTube, and of course, stream it at theriskadvisor.com. Thanks again for listening and hope you tune in again next week.